smell of damp leaves, and the light would be thin enough to make our lamps meaningful. Marta promised invitations. Kurt promised publicity within limits. Clara promised to handle scheduling. Anja promised to be present and steady. Leni promised, with the solemnity of someone who is asked to keep a secret, to make a body of paintings that would not be decorative, but conversational. On leaving the gallery that evening, with a small envelope in my hand, a tentative date, a scribbled list of technical requirements, I felt both lighter and weightier than I had since the accident. Leni waved at me without theatrics and walked beside me for a block in which she told me, simply and without flourish, about a wash of apricot she wanted to try that would be thin enough to let blue show through. I listened and, for a small moment, practiced being a man who could accept direction, rather than being the sole director of his destiny. It was a small apprenticeship in humility. Back at my flat, I opened the piano and touched a middle C. The note felt ordinary in my fingers, an object with a measurable attack and decay. The color I once felt was absent, but there was, now, the company of other minds, Marta's economy, Kurt's impatience, Clara's steadiness, Anja's practicality, and Lena's imaginative insistence. Perhaps that was enough to begin. Before sleep took me, I thought about the ethics Clara had named. Would we make Leni a partner or a symbol? I promised myself and her mother that I would try, actively and sometimes clumsily, to keep her from being used. That promise felt like the first real composition I had written in months, not a bar of music, but a contract of conduct. It was nothing like the old promise of virtuosity. It was, instead, a modest agreement about how to make something together without the pretense of restoration. And even as I tried to speak kindly to the future, a small, practical dread lodged in my throat. Rehearsals would come. There would be dress rehearsals in the gallery under those carefully chosen lights. There would be moments when my hands would not remember what they had learned. There would be, perhaps, a night when my timing would break, and the paint across from me would have to answer for what I could not supply. I thought of that possibility and did not flinch away from it. For the first time in a long time, I could imagine a failure that would not end me. That, in its own dry way, was a revelation. We would begin soon enough. For now, the gallery proposal existed as a set of papers in a leather folder, and as the image of Lena's small canvases under a soft lamp. It was not a promise of cure. It was not a promise of a return to the old map. But it was an opening, and openings require one to step through a threshold, however cautiously. When I turned off the lamp and lay in bed, the city dimmed to a hum. I felt the outline of the evening we had tentatively agreed to, as if it were a draft of music, not yet in full tone, but with a shape that might be rehearsed into integrity. The last thing I heard before sleep was the quiet rustle of paper from the leather folder on my table. The next act was to begin preparations. The first rehearsal loomed like a question. I did not know the answer. That, I told myself before sleep closed in, would be the point. I keep telling myself that preparation is a sequence of small truths. There is comfort in the verb. It suggests work, habit, the dismantling of anxiety into manageable acts, a phone call, a seating plan, the exchange of an invoice. When Marta called that morning, the voice at the other end was all commerce and counsel. She spoke of meters of wall space, insurance clauses, the theater of light that would best respect Lena's paintings. Kurt wanted to know how many seats we should put between the piano and the nearest observer, as if distance were a lever you could tune. It is strange how the public details of presentation, where to hang a canvas, what wattage will not glare, can become private crucibles. I was in the gallery at midday, the door giving a small sullen squeak, the air smelling faintly of new plaster and the cold metal tang that comes from long closed spaces opening. The room is narrower than the photographs suggested, the ceiling lower, a back wall of unadorned white weights to receive Lena's work. When I unlatched the piano cover, the wood answered with a dull, domestic hollow that seemed at once too intimate and too exposed. Leni was there already, knees dusty from the pavement, a satchel of canvases leaning at her feet. She had a small sensible cap on, her braid loose, and the earnest, unadorned attention of a child given a new order. Her hands, which I had watched once map colors beside a greengrocer's stall, were now stained with washes of ultramarine and ochre. The marks ran like country maps over her knuckles. She moved around the gallery as if it were a house she had been given to arrange, placing one canvas here, stepping back, tilting her head, shifting a frame a finger's breadth this way and that. Marta arrived with a flashlight and a notepad, her expression the practiced economy of the person who has long learned that preparation is the architecture of calm. She took stock in a few sentences, assigning numbers and measurements. We should have 3 panels behind the piano. Keep the lighting soft, no spots from above. Insurance will require a list of the works and their provenance. Kurt will handle the invitations, no one over a certain press threshold, please. She looked at Leanie with the kind of appraisal that registers promise and risk in the same breath. I sat at the piano and played for a little while, a few chords I had known so long they occupied the space between habit and reflex. Sound without color is a peculiar thing. You feel the physical contours of vibration and the architecture of pitch, but the interior mapping that used to come, those faint, involuntary flares of pigment, do not. The notes sat like objects in a newly catalogued room, accurate, intelligible, strangely mute. Yet when Leanie set a small canvas behind the music stand, its wash of deep blue, the pigment thick and decided, seemed to provide an axis. I had the odd sensation of following a tide. That one's for the slow part, she said, the deep part, make it breathe. Her voice is blunt in an idiomatic way. There is no smallness of self-consciousness in it. She put her hand on the blue as if touching a sleeve. And that little red stripe there when you go sharp. But don't overdo it. There is a kind of absurd economy to giving instruction to the man who once had an inner map the size of a continent. I was aware of 2 voices in me, the thin expert who corrected the angle of a wrist, and the older, gentler one that remembered a time when such advice would have been redundant. I tried the passage again. This time I paid attention to the cadence of my breathing, to the length of the line I wanted the room to hold, and to the way the blue, placed at eye level, asked for a particular kind of patience. At the building's threshold, Inspector Holler arrived mid-afternoon, a man who has made discretion his work. He belongs to that category of officialdom that moves politely through rooms and leaves a sense of procedure in its wake. He asked for a seat and a glass of water, making small talk like a notary, and then, with almost judicial calm, beginning to place questions about the night at the hall, about witnesses, about what I had felt in that first terrible instant. His presence is not merely practical. It is as if, by stepping into this modest rehearsal, the past had reached across the months and taken hold of the present. Felix was on the periphery. He wore his usual nervous curiosity like a coat and asked how I was feeling, though his pen was ready to turn an answer into copy. He tried, with the solicitousness of a journalist who has seen many confessions, to translate my evasions into a narrative. People want to understand why, he said. They will want to hear whether you feel like the old Matthias. They will want detail. He smiled as if he were offering a kindness. I recognized the machinery. Public appetite for spectacle or contrition arrives armed with a vocabulary of absolution, accusation, and headline. Kurt fretted about tickets and capacity. The promoter's voice is always tuned to numbers. If we can get the press to come early, we can shape the narrative, he said. We need to make attendance look like intent, not a big hall intimacy. Tell the right people and they will tell the rest. There was the familiar seduction of crafting myth, and Marta gently cut the suggestion down. No, we make it honest. We keep it small. We invite those who know how to listen and not those who need a miracle. Her sentence felt like a negotiation of ethics made prosaic. During the lull that followed, Herb Baum stepped into the gallery, stooped and deliberate, his white hair a kind of map of past decades. He carried a cloth-bound score under his arm. His presence was a quiet reminder of endurance rather than spectacle. Discipline first, he said later, when we were outside in the alley, his breath making small clouds as if the city itself were cold to the bones of what we attempted. A performance is a ledger. You must record where you are. Then you can be honest about the rest. His blunt counsel had a firmness that felt like a hand on the shoulder. Back in my flat, the accumulation of canvas continued. Linny had taken to arriving early, her small trolley of paints and primed panels a kind of ritual that kept her days honest. She worked in a sort of deliberate economy, blocking color, stepping back, tilting, scraping. There was no melodrama in her process. What there was a strictness of attention that resembled craftsmanship. Her mother, Anja, came sometimes to observe and sometimes to bring an apple. She spoke with the practical suspicion of one who has learned that art does not always feed the household. The legal thread felt constant. Inspector Haller's inquiries do not intrude with cruelty. They intrude with the patient insistence of official memory. He asks for dates, for times, for the names of those who stood near. Each answer is accurate and leaves a residual oddness. I finish the sentence and feel as if I have given a piece of my private geography to a ledger. The state makes a concision of narrative that is indifferent to nuance. I find this hard to reconcile. The accident was an event that happened at the edge of what I knew, and procedure reduces its interior fog to a set of facts. Felix, by contrast, wants a story. He probes for confession, for the moment of revelation that will make copy. He passes between sympathy and insinuation with a deftness that irritates me. "People want to see how you manage this," he said once, in a small restaurant over coffee. "They like the arc fall, struggle, rise. They'll forgive if there's a rise." His eyes sought as if he could find the shape of that rise written on me. I said nothing, and the silence may have annoyed him more than any refusal. At home, Clara came over one evening with a tray. Her entry was, as it always had been, efficient, with restraint. She put the tray down on the table, arranged the cups with a neatness that felt like a small blessing, and sat opposite me. The conversation between us is never florid. We are both practiced in the economy of feeling. "What do you want this to be?" she asked. It was not a rhetorical question. I had known, intellectually, that the event before us was a compromise between what others wanted and what I could bear. But when she asked me to articulate my aim, there was an immediate, unforeseeable difficulty. "I want it not to be a demonstration," I said at last. "I want it to be honest about what is missing. I don't mean that as a publicity bit. I mean that musically. I want people to listen to the absence as an intentional space." Clara's face softened. "Then say that," she said. "Say that before you play, or let the program say it. People will come with fewer expectations if we place the frame honestly. The ones who can listen will remain. The rest won't be disappointed." Her suggestion was practical and kind. It offered a way of shaping reception that did not rely on misdirection. We argued logistics, and then we spoke about smaller matters, schedules, and who would bring what, and in the practicalities, I found a small ease. The act of choosing is a laneway out of anxiety. Choose the lighting, choose the seating, choose the people who will stand near the wall. Each choice is a small refusal to let the past dictate terms wholly. Still, the old ghosts arrive in the small hours. I wake with fragments of performance in my head, fingering that once contained whole arcades of color, and the memory of the hall's lighting on that night, when everything changed. Often now I imagine the public eye as a kind of lantern, moving over the city, illuminating and flattening. The preparation for the gallery is not merely technical. It is an exercise in acquiring a new grammar for presence. I do not know if I will ever wholly shed the muscle of earlier shows. There are reflexes that curling in the dark refuse to die, but I can choose the terms by which I present myself. Toward the end of the week, Kurt announced we had sold a modest but respectable number of tickets. He was relieved in the way people are when numbers align with narrative. Marta was less sanguine, noting who had been invited and who had declined. There is a peculiar intimacy to the list of acceptances and refusals. The people who attend a small event are not merely an audience, they are witnesses. I found myself composing, in imagination, the shape of the room that would hold us, a low light, the piano slightly turned, Lena's paintings arranged like a chorus behind me. The last rehearsal before the dress run was to be tomorrow. I left the gallery that evening with a single small canvas under my arm one Lenny had placed delicately into my hands, a wash of blue with a narrow red line like a scar. "Keep it where you can see it while you sleep," she said, as if the thing mattered little and mattered very much. In the street the city had that mild, metallic cold that makes conversation rare and puts attention inwards. I felt the pressure of the next day like a hand on the back of my neck, not violent, but persistent. There are choices to be made yet. How much to say in the program, who will speak before the first movement, whether we will allow a few photographers in for documentation only. Each of these feels significant, though they might appear trivial to an indifferent observer. The old ghosts do not simply vanish because the walls are measured and the canvases hung. They are there in the small way the keys resist, or the way an otherwise familiar phrase opens into a new, uncertain shape. That night, at home, I placed the small canvas on the piano and sat longer than usual. Lena's blue was quiet in the lamplight, the red a small insistence. I thought of her Baum's ledger and Clara's simple question and Inspector Holler's circular memory. The city's distant noises threaded the window, a tram, a dog, a heater's cough. I tried for a while to practice without expectation only the page, the rhythm, the small mechanical truth of articulation. The hand moves and the mind follows, and for a few minutes there was a line that seemed to hold. A modest, honest phrase. When I stopped, I left the lid open and sat watching the blue. Outside, someone laughed, a brief, human sound that found its way like a wedge of heat into the cold street. I understood, with that particular clarity that arrives without grandness, that tomorrow's rehearsal would be brittle. The dress rehearsal would not magically alter the essential fact of my altered perception. But we had made other kinds of work: Marta's careful ceilings, Kurt's pragmatic seating, Lena's paintings that now stretched in a small chorus across a white wall. We had put together an assemblage of small truths. That, perhaps, was the point, to stand in the room with the honest shape of who we were, and to allow an audience to enter it. Later, in the hour before sleep, I wrote a short note to her Baum, "Thank you for the ledger and the hand." To Clara I wrote only, "Your question held." To Marta I sent the list of the works that would hang and an apology for any last-minute changes. To Leni I wrote, "Keep painting." She replied with a drawing of a floor plan, colored in with blocks of tone, and one small red line where the piano would be. "The gallery will smell tomorrow of primer and paint, and the faintly sharp tang of human breath. The light will be arranged to respect color without theatrics. We will move into presence not as a demand for miracle, but as a small protocol of listening. Still, the old ghosts are not wholly contained. There will be the memory of the hall, the file of the accident, the reporters who will want narrative arcs. I do not know whether the dress rehearsal will falter or surprise, nor do I know if I will find in the room a new voice that feels like an extension rather than an apology. When I blew out the lamp that night, the blue sat in the dark like a promise, or an accusation, I could not tell which. I slept badly and dreamt of a stage without edges. I woke knowing that the next day would bring the first real test of everything we had prepared. I felt, beneath the expectant dread, a small, steady resolve to go and stand in the light we had chosen, and to play with what we had made together. The gallery's door would open, and when it did, something, either failure or an awkward, genuine accord would answer. The gallery smelled of paint and lemon oil. I had expected the scent, and in a peculiar way it steadied me. It belonged to Lenny and to the work we had made together, and that fact alone cut a small space free from the vertiginous present. The lighting was cool and narrow, a band that fell across the Steinway like a pale ribbon. Lena's canvases hung on the white walls behind where I would be seated, their washes of color and insistence that refused both to dramatize and to flatter. They were patient there, the ultramarines and muddies and thin streaks of red that she favored, as if someone had left notes to an absent musician and trusted he would read them slowly. Marta arrived early, as she always did, with the precise gait of a woman who had spent a lifetime converting anxiety into lists. She wore the kind of suit that suggested business and, in a softer register, the capacity to wait. She unfurled a leather folder and produced a timing sheet, a list of guests and contingencies. Kurt hovered then somewhere between utility and alarm, his hands making little questions in the air. Clara came with 2 cups of tea balanced on a tray and placed them beside the piano with an economy of movement that said doing small things with care could be a form of allegiance. There were other, smaller attendants, a lighting technician with a lamp bag, an intern who had been instructed to keep to the shadows, and Leanie herself, who occupied a folding chair a little to the side, knees together, paint on the knuckles of her left hand like the residue of some ritual. She had on the scarf she always wore, flecked ultramarine and the faint suggestion of something ochre. She did not smile. She sat looking, which for her was a kind of thinking. When the pianist takes his place before an audience, there is usually a single, private motion and intake of breath, a tiny alignment of shoulder and wrist. The counting that arrives silently behind the teeth. It is a ritual that is part rehearsal, part superstition. I performed that motion now with the economy of someone who knows the choreography of anxiety. I felt the wood of the bench beneath me, the cool lacquer of the fallboard under my fingertips, and a small, cleaving thought. This is the place where the past and the attempt to be present will meet, and one of them will yield. The first piece was modest by design, a short movement whose score I had pared down to essentials. A friend in the conservatory once told me that honesty in music is like a light bulb in a dark room. It reveals the dust you have learned to live with. I thought of that as I placed my hands on the keys. The opening bars, which I had practiced in the air of my flat until my fingers surprised me with their facility, unspooled with an ease that confused me. For a moment I was only present to what my hands could do, and not to the absence that sat behind them. Then the phrase arrived, a turn I had known by heart, and my internal map, the one that used to show color like constellations, failed to light. It was not a grand blackout, rather a dimming, a cigarette gone out mid-inhalation. My fingers hesitated on a note I would have previously felt as a swell of indigo. Timing, which in the conservatory was a companion that taught you where to sleep and where to wake, smudged and slipped. A small error bred its own gravity. The next bar arrived a fraction too early. The hand that should have waited did not. Sound mercilessly honest, made a splice where there should have been a seam. There are kinds of self-consciousness that become visible in heat. My fingers became clumsy. My left wrist flapped like a bird caught at the window. I realized too late that I had begun to play with a defensive attention, as if the only thing I could do was to guard what was left. The notes were correct, precise. An auditor might have noted the craftsmanship with a kind of clinical respect, but the music, that living logic of phrase and breath, refused to crown itself. It fell ragged into silence between bars. Marta made a small sound then, the intake that means she is shifting from the private register of hope into the public commerce of contingency. Kurt's mouth compressed. Clara's hand on my shoulder was quick and feather-light, a touch that did not interfere with the small eclipse I felt under my skin. Leanie did not stir. Her eyes remained on the canvases as if the colors themselves might tell her what I had failed to conjure. We tried the passage again. I told myself to be mechanical, to set aside whatever lack of color I felt and rely on notation and memory. Muscular recollection is a kind of pedagogy. You can teach the body to do things when the mind is uncertain. The left hand behaved, the right hand took up its cues. But the more I insisted on the mechanical, the more brittle the result. The music sounded as if it had been washed in cold light, cleaned of the smudges that make a phrase human. The gallery, which had the initial hush of respectful curiosity, now harbored a tension like a held breath. After the third attempt, the panic arrived. Panic in performance is not theatrical. There is no trumpet call, no grand collapse. It is small, private, idiotic in its specificity, a tightening of the throat that arrests the flow of thought, a sudden forgetfulness of how one shapes a legato line. I paused. The silence that followed was a room in itself. Clara put down her cup of tea and sat closer. Marta's fingers opened the leather folder, and read the lists as if that could steady the world. Kurt pressed an energetic, then smile that had the quality of someone trying to add confidence by way of insistence. "I can stop if you want," Marta said, the voice carefully neutral. No one had to tell me the consequences of stopping. To cancel would be to hand every narrative advantage back to a public appetite that wanted catharsis, drama, or spectacle. It would signal weakness to those who wished to see weakness, and prudence to those who wished for honesty. I thought also of Leanie, of how she had painted days and evenings onto small boards for me, as if she were making scaffolding from pigment. To stop would be to deny what she had offered, and I felt something like shame at the idea of abandoning her art to the dust of an aborted plan. "Not yet," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. "Give me a moment." Clara inclined her head. "Breathe," she said. She spoke the word without ceremony, like a doctor stating a simple physiological fact. The effect of such economy on me was oddly restorative. I sat and closed my eyes, not to summon color but to feel the ribs move under the sternum, to anchor myself in the one thing the panic could not take entirely, the body. I opened my eyes to see the canvases again. Lena's paint had dried into a map of gestures. The lines where the brush had hesitated were visible as small knots in the washes. There was a painting in particular, a panel of layered blues interrupted by a slash of thin red, that had accompanied one of the pieces I intended to play. The slash was pure and small, a punctuation of color. For reasons I could not immediately own, it occurred to me that the slash was what the melody needed in that bar where my ear had softened. I do not claim a mysticism here. Rather, a plain recognition that the visual and the oral can sometimes answer each other across a gulf. When I resumed, I allowed myself to listen not only with the ear but with another, tacit mode that had learned to inhabit Lena's work. I attempted the phrase slowly, mapping each harmonic contour against the stripe of color behind me. At times the correlation seemed absurdly literal, a low cluster of tones matched by a downwash of blue in which the ultramarine pooled like light. At others the painting suggested a shape, a way for the phrase to resolve. This reliance felt, strangely, like cheating an external prosthetic, but it also offered a kind of cueing that my altered brain could accept. We made some progress this way. Some passages regained a fragile coherence, yet the rehearsal was not rescued. There were bars where memory abandoned me altogether, places where the hand reached and found nothing but an expectation of color that did not exist. The audience of our small contingent, which before had been patient, now registered concern with the small incline of heads, the exchange of notes. Kurt's impatience folded into insistence. Marta's list consulted contingencies. At one point I heard her jot a line that read, "Consider cancellation if more than 3 failures in a row." The words landed like stones. Leanie, when I glanced at her, had the look of someone trying to be useful in a language she had only just begun to learn. She had brought with her a small tray of paints and a jam jar of turpentine, a childish, practical provision. She had painted during the pauses, fingers finding thin marks and small corrections on a spare canvas. The act of seeing her paint while I failed was both confounding and consoling. It suggested that the work we were making together was not merely a theatrical device, but a process, a slow accretion of action and response. At one point I placed my head in my hands. "I'm sorry," I said to no one in particular. The apology felt both unnecessary and necessary. It acknowledged a debt to all the people who had believed in my earlier self and to Leanie, who had perhaps believed in a recovery I could not promise. "You're asking too much of yourself," Clara said, sitting beside me. Her voice was practical rather than consoling. This was never going to be a miracle. It was always going to be a negotiation. I looked at her. "Negotiation with what?" "With absence," she said simply. "With what you have now, not what you had then." There was a ruthless clarity in that sentence. It cut through the sentimental architectures I had been constructing in my head. If the rehearsal had become a contest between the past and the present, Clara's sentence proposed a different arrangement, a contract with diminished goods but honest terms. The question, then, was whether I had the imagination to draft those terms in public, or whether I would prefer to keep trying to make the old map appear